The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello, I'm Marcia Alvar, and welcome to Upon Reflection, where my guest today is writer and humorist Calvin Trillin. In 1963, Trillin joined The New Yorker as a staff writer. Since then, he's spent a good deal of time traveling around the country, finding and writing about the subjects that capture his interest. His love of food, his dread of mimes, and his fascination with conflict, with eccentricity, and murder. Trillin's newest book is a collection of essays based on his travels called American Stories. Welcome to Upon Reflection. I listed a few of the things, the many things that you write about. Is there a way to describe what makes something or someone or some place the kind of story you want to do?
Yeah, sometimes, well, I mean, there are a number of ways. Sometimes it's the place or the combination of the place and what happened in it. I mean, there's the first story in this book takes place in Central Oregon, which in many ways seems a very peaceful place, very beautiful. A lot of people there because they preferred the outdoors to whatever they were doing in the valley or in California or someplace like that. And it turns out to have kind of a violent story taking place in it. So sometimes it's almost the combination of the place and what happens. Sometimes it's the characters. There's a story in the book about a distribution argument between Ben & Jerry's ice cream and Haagen-Dazs ice cream. And I think it starts by saying reduced to its essentials. This was an argument, fairly straightforward legal argument about distribution, restraint of trade, but nobody was ever tempted to reduce it to its essentials because the players were a lot more interesting than the games.
And the history of the ice cream business.
The history of the ice cream business is interesting, and or of the what they call the super premium ice cream business. And of course, the founder of Haagen-Dazs, Reuben Mattis, is an interesting man, a kind of a prototypical immigrant entrepreneur who worked his head off and had this one brilliant idea. After half of a lifetime of making cheap bulk ice cream with everybody else, suddenly turned around, marched exactly in the opposite direction, and invented Haagen-Dazs. Not only the ice cream, but the name. I mean, as you probably know, it means about the same to a Dane as it would mean to you. And Ben & Jerry, of course, are what I think we now think of as hippie entrepreneurs, and people whose response to business success is not gratitude at a country that given them an opportunity like this, but kind of amusement that the world is so odd that people as weird as they are accepted as respectable businessmen. So in a way, that I was drawn by the characters in some way in that story, and sometimes there's kind of an element of something that interests me. I think I originally did the story that's called something like the saga of Joe Bob Briggs so far. Because it interested me that the film critic of the Dallas Times-Herald, John Bloom, who was rather reserved.
And who's actually sort of disappeared by now.
Yeah, he's gone.
Joe Bob
Briggs. He's been kind of swallowed up. He's inside Joe Bob somewhere probably. That he would have this alter ego, this other persona inside of him, that he was able to turn from a rather almost withdrawn young man, honors graduate of Vanderbilt who had a great interest in the French Nouvelle Vague, and on Fridays turn into this kind of crazed 19-year-old drive-in movie fanatic redneck named Joe Bob Briggs. But of course, when I got down there, it turned out that in some way, that still was interesting to me, but also in some ways, what also became interesting to me at that point was the context of the story, which was really not just Dallas, but the newspaper war in Dallas, the economic situation and ups and downs in Dallas that kind of paralleled the newspaper war. So a lot of times I start with the notion of one thing and find another, and a lot of times I start without much notion at all. I mean, there's a story in there about a friend of mine named Tom Cheney, who was a, as he described it, reformed editorial writer. I had met him originally when he was a newspaper man. Reformed editorial writer, a reformed college teacher, a reformed Baptist minister. He always said he went to a small Baptist college for small Baptists, who had gone to Horse Cave, Kentucky, his hometown, to go into the corn and tobacco farming business with his Aunt Daisy, and had written me that friends, he always thought friends ought to keep in touch and let each other know when they've changed addresses, and his had changed involuntarily to the federal penitentiary in Lexington because of what he said was renting some corn and tobacco land to some folks he knew were going to grow something other than corn and tobacco, and what the government called conspiracy to manufacture a controlled substance.
And how that story unfolds, I mean, you couldn't come up with fiction like this with it.
Well, that's right. And then
local
of course,
characters.
yeah, when I got down there, I realized that it was really a story about stories, about storytelling, and about how everything gets folded into a story in a place like Horse Cave among storytellers like Tom.
I think I had gone through about 7 or 8 of the essays in this book when it occurred to me, because it's called American Stories, what would it be like if somebody from another country who'd never been to America but was going to come and didn't know very much was given your book as a kind of introduction to America or America 101, and what kind of notion they would have of the country when they had finished the last page and what they'd expect to find when they came here?
I don't know. I never thought of that. I mean, I guess I would hope that they would get a reasonably broad and realistic impression of the country. It's not the one, of course, that they would get from either the tourist brochures or what they know from the movies, or even what they read in the paper, since most of the paper is devoted to government and politics and celebrities. I hope it will be a fair reflection of the country, both the good part of the country and the bad part, and good and bad's really kind of the wrong way to put it. I suppose I mean, if you look at any of these stories, there's a lot that's very American in them, not just the settings, but the way people feel about behavior and whose side they're on, and how they feel about violence, and how they feel about all sorts of things that some people might consider trivial. But I hope when they're taken all together that they would be a fair reflection of at least parts of America. I mean, I think I've always tried in these stories and other stories to avoid the notion that somehow these are parables that can stand for the country. One of the nice things about the New Yorker, where these things appeared originally, is that you don't have to justify your presence someplace. You don't have to have what newspapers call the nut graph, and we used to call it Time years ago the billboard paragraph. That is, why is a person such as yourself doing a story about somebody other than the Secretary of State or something? And the billboard paragraph in Time would say, always in a cover story, and back in the book cover story, that wasn't the Secretary of State or somebody like that, would say, oh, some orchestra leaders are more famous, some of them have a greater knowledge of music, but no orchestra leader so symbolizes the such and such and such of American music.
It's almost an apology for the story.
Yeah, it's a justification for being there. And often that takes the form of using what you're writing about as a sort of example or symbol of something that's happening in the country. There's a very classic newspaper story, if they're going to write about the loss of jobs, say in the Sun Belt, among people who had come down from the Rust Belt to get jobs several years ago. They might start with Joe Jones and his wife, who came from Detroit years ago, et cetera, et cetera. They get through, and then they say the Joneses are among the many people. They're
but one.
And they stand as symbol. Well, I always thought that that's the kind of opposite of the sort of thing I do. I always thought that's just a good story, and that's about this one guy in Oregon and this one boy in Oregon, and you can draw whatever implications you want from it, but it isn't meant to represent anything.
When you go to Sisters, Oregon, or Emporia, Kansas, where you wrote a story about a quite involved and I'm sure very upsetting murder case, how do you get close to the story? I mean, here you saunter into town and you want to know things that probably a lot of people don't particularly want you to know.
You know, I've always thought that that's less of a problem than people make it out to be, or maybe that a lot of reporters make it out to be, since it sounds harder if they talk about it as very difficult. But I'm not terribly aggressive about these things, and I don't kind of sneak around pretending to be the mailman or anything like that. But I've never gone to a story, and I'm now talking about the sort of reporting I do as opposed to finding out which congressman has gotten paid off by somebody, which is an entirely different kind of reporting, and would be difficult, at least for me to do. I've never felt at the end of a place that I don't actually know what happened, that there are big gaps in the story. Of course, I have the luxury of staying until I'm kind of satisfied myself, but if you do have that luxury, I think if you ask enough people, because there are always a lot of different sides to the story, for one thing.
They're all like Rashomon in a way.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in something like that, one side kind of wants to tell you stuff that the other side doesn't. And even when there aren't a lot of sides, everybody has a different notion of what's secret, what part of the story is secret, and what shouldn't be told. So if you talk to enough people, you really, I mean, that doesn't seem to me, and I really do speak as someone who doesn't think of himself as terribly good at that, at the kind of what ferreting out, it's sometimes referred, ferreting out the facts. I don't think of myself as ferret-like in these things, but I don't think it's much of a problem as long as you have the time to talk to a lot of people.
What kind of reactions do you get from those places when the stories are published? And does it matter to you whether they've liked the story or haven't liked the story, or thought it was particularly accurate?
The last thing would bother me if they didn't think it was particularly accurate. If they liked it or didn't like it, it's not anything I could do much about. But if they said, you totally misunderstood what's going on here, if I thought they were right, that would bother me a lot. Or if you got this entirely wrong, this guy who you called this thing really was something else, and I mean that sort of thing would obviously be troubling. But as far as whether they liked it or not, in the first place, I think it's kind of unpredictable. I mean, a lot of times people are insulted by a part of the story that you hadn't even thought about as insulting, because you don't know what people consider, what they're sensitive about. And I did a story once on Gerald L.K. Smith, who was an old-time kind of anti-Semite and right-wing nut who, I mean, he had a long career, but he was in the American First, and then he kind of veered off into, I would say he was a professional anti-Semite. He had a magazine and things, and then he went to a little town called Eureka Springs, Arkansas, supposedly to retire, and then he decided, wouldn't it be nice, because he was a minister of some sort, to have a statue of Jesus next to where they had these Easter services, and pretty soon, and then he said, wouldn't it be nice to have a passion play, and pretty soon he had a passion play. And so he had, Eureka Springs had all these townspeople in this kind of anti-Semitic passion play. And I went there, and I found, among other things, that he was getting, through some kind of complicated deals, some government money, some federal money, to build a road up to the anti-Semitic passion play. And I mentioned that in the piece, not in a way denouncing it, but simply mentioning it. And I mean, mentioning it was enough. But that's not what bothered them. What really bothered them was that I was in the passion play one night, and you could do that. And
or you could just go there and be in the play?
Well, kind of, yeah. They allowed me to do it. You know, I said I was interested in doing it, and my wife too. She played. I can't remember. I played, I believe, St. Luke, as I remember. Well, you didn't have, and it was all taped, so you know, it was so you could say anything you wanted to, and it was in this huge amphitheater, and their taped voices came out. And I found that what people said was a lot of insulting and snotty and silly things. Now that really made them mad. That made them madder than anything. And who would have known of all the things that piece said, that's what would irritate them. And I think all reporters have this experience, that you can't really worry about what people think exactly, because it's unpredictable. There's no way to know what people think. I mean, I would just talk to somebody in Portland who's done some pieces on skinheads and Nazis and everything for The Nation. And I said, you know, did you have to stop talking? She's now doing a book about it. Did you have to stop talking to them after a piece came out in The Nation? She said, oh, they liked it. Well, I mean, it was not exactly favorable to them. I mean, but you just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the pieces in this book, I wanted to have you just read a part of it, the beginning of this piece. It deals with another writer who you like very much. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the police beat in Miami. Sort of introduce our viewers to Edna Buchanan from Covering the Cops.
This is the beginning of a piece called Covering the Cops. In the newsroom of the Miami Herald, there is some disagreement about which of Edna Buchanan's first paragraphs stands as the classic Edna lead. I line up with the fried chicken faction. The fried chicken story was about a rowdy ex-con named Gary Robinson, who late one Sunday night lurched drunkenly into a Church's outlet, shoved his way to the front of the line, and ordered a 3-piece box of fried chicken. Persuaded to wait his turn, he reached the counter again 5 or 10 minutes later, only to be told the Church's had run out of fried chicken. The young woman at the counter suggested that he might like chicken nuggets instead. Robinson responded to the suggestion by slugging her in the head. That set off a chain of events that ended with Robinson's being shot dead by a security guard. Edna Buchanan covered the killing for the Herald. There are policemen in Miami who say that it wouldn't be a killing without her. And her story began with what the fried chicken faction still regards as the classic Edna lead. Gary Robinson died hungry. All connoisseurs would agree, I think, that the classic Edna lead would have to include one staple of crime reporting, a simple, matter-of-fact statement that registers with a jolt. The question is where the jolt should be. There's a lot to be said for starting right out with it. I'm rather partial to the Edna lead on a story last year about a woman about to go on trial for a murder conspiracy. Bad things happen to the husbands of Widow Elkin. On the other hand, I can understand the preference that others have for the device of beginning a crime story with a more or less conventional sentence or two, then snapping the reader back in his chair with an abbreviated sentence that is used like a blunt instrument. One student of the forum at the Herald refers to that device as the Miller chop. The reference is to Gene Miller, now a Herald editor, who in a remarkable reporting career that concentrated on the felonious, won the Pulitzer Prize twice for stories that resulted in the release of people in prison for murder. Miller likes short sentences in general. It is sometimes said at the Herald that he writes as if he were paid by the period. and he particularly likes to use a short sentence after a couple of rather long ones. Some years ago, Gene Miller and Enda Buchanan did a story together on the murder of a high-living Miami lawyer who was shot to death on a day he had planned to while away on the golf course of Lagos Country Club. And the lead said, "He had his clubs in the trunk of his Cadillac. Wednesday looked like an easy day. He figured he might pick up a game later with Eddie Arcaro, the jockey. He didn't." These days, Miller sometimes edits the longer pieces that Enda Buchanan does for the Herald, and she often uses the Miller chop, as in a piece about a lover's spat. The man she loved slapped her face. Furious, she says she never told him never, ever to do that again. "What are you going to do, kill me?" he asked, and handed her a gun. "Here, kill me," he challenged. She did.
Why is it so hard to find writing like that in newspapers?
Well, newspaper people don't have as much time as magazine people. I mean, for years, for 15 years, I did a piece every 3 weeks from around the country, and 3,000-word piece, and magazine people would just be astounded at that and said, how can you possibly work at that pace? And newspaper people say, is that all you do? There's a different pace, and if you have to turn in the piece for tomorrow's paper, which is less true these days than it was, say, when I was doing those 3,000-word pieces. I think more papers, at least more good papers like the Miami Herald, are willing to give people some time to write a piece that requires some digging and some writing. And I noticed the series that just started this week by Bartlett and Steele from the Philadelphia Inquirer says they've been working on it for a couple of years. I mean, this is so it's, but that's really unusual. Usually, newspaper people are writing under deadlines. Then there's another big reason, and that is the New Yorker doesn't have some of the sort of strictures that a newspaper would have. For instance, in a piece about, let's say I did a piece some years ago about a farmer in Iowa during the kind of boom in land who found himself rich. I mean, a hardworking, uneducated, good manager, farmer, in a county in Iowa that they say has the richest land in Iowa, which is, I say in the first sentence of the piece, what people in Iowa say, which means would be the richest land in the world. I mean, it's good farming land. And at one point, there was a boom in that land, and on paper at least, this man was rich for the first time. And he started to do some things like buy and sell cattle that kind of let you kind of be in wild places like Kansas City after 5 o'clock with nothing to do and that sort of thing. But eat or you know, get into trouble. And for corn and grain people who have always kind of come home for dinner in the middle of the day, that's quite a change. And there were some other changes, and he kind of found I guess you'd have to say Popsy really in a shopping center bar in Cedar Rapids, and eventually he was convicted of killing his wife. Well, in the story that I wrote, this comes out fairly late in the story, that his wife was killed. If I wrote that for a newspaper, some editor would say, hey, come on.
That's the lead. That's
the lead. The woman was killed. Because they're in the news business, and I'm in the story business, really, in a way. And he would say, you can't have a story where you don't even know whether a woman gets killed until the end. Then they'd also have a picture that would have her, and then on the caption it would say, did she fall or was she pushed, or something like that, ruining my story.
It takes time, and things have to be unfolded,
yeah,
and all
you can
of the
just kind
facets
of,
displayed.
Yeah, and so in a way, writing a story, a narrative story for a newspaper or for most magazines is kind of like trying to tell a story in front of the fire when when your loud Uncle Harry's in the room, and he's constantly saying, "No, no, that's," and telling the punchline, or the little turn in the story that you had saved just for that time when you thought you could just get by it and fool people.
I think he sat behind me at movies.
Yeah, Uncle Harry. Well, yeah, he goes to the movies constantly. That's where he hears a lot of those stories, and so there are some restrictions on newspaper writing that make it harder, I think, and there's still a lot of great writing in newspapers.
We have very little time left, but I wanted to ask you, in the travels that you've done and in all parts of the country, if there's still regional difference left and regional character that makes places around the country distinct despite all of the mass media that seem to smush everybody into
Absolutely.
one thing.
I mean, I don't see, I mean, in fact, it may be more that way. I mean, I was waiting here in the snack bar, and I was thinking that this snack bar doesn't even have the same things in the little fast food refrigerator that you would have, say, in Houston.
You notice the biscotti basket by the...
Biscotti basket, a vegetarian burrito. I mean, this is a kind of a Seattle snack bar. I mean, it's a different, and of course that's a superficial thing, but I think it also, there's a wonderful theory about American regions called first effective settlement that was propagated by a regionalist at Penn State named Wilbur Zielinski, one of my heroes. And it's basically that whoever settles a place first, really, I mean, in an effective way, doesn't just pass through and get slaughtered or something by the Indians, but really settles down, kind of sets the tone of the place. And so the places really are different. They're even different if you look at a map, say, of religions in the United States. I used to have a map of 1950 religions in the United States by color, show either Stripe County for over 25% church membership or Solid for over 50%. And you can really see the country. It's a different sort of, you know, there are those Lutheran green coming down from the north, and there's this blob of gray for the Mormons kind of slurping out over. I mean, it's really a different place.
Well, maybe we'll have you come back and just focus your energies and your attentions on the Northwest. Next time you come around, come and stay longer.
Thank you, Marcia.
Calvin Trillin, thank you so much.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.